Right, we're right on 2 o'clock. I'm not going to wait to get started because there is quite a bit of content to get through. So I'll keep an eye on the lobby and make sure I keep adding people as they come through. But I just want to say a warm welcome and good afternoon to all of you who have joined me this afternoon for this tender writing webinar. My name is Stacey DeCalma and I'm the Executive Director for Workforce Planning and Sector Development here at the Queensland Council of Social Service, or QCOS as you probably know us. We are the peak body for the community services sector in Queensland, and it's a real pleasure for us to deliver these tender writing workshops across the state. We're right at the end of our regional workshops, which is why we're at a point now where we deliver an online option for all those who weren't able to get to their regional workshops across the state. So the team has been hard at work delivering these workshops in all different towns across Queensland. We have been working in partnership with Desbert for many years now, delivering these workshops to really support the community services sector to take up the great initiative, which is Skilling Queenslanders for Work. So regardless of your experience in writing tenders or even leveraging from the opportunity of Skilling Queenslanders for Work, welcome. I hope you all learn something from the session today and have some of your questions asked. And I think many of these skills and tips that we talk about today, you will be able to apply across your tender writing, across different funding opportunities. Okay, now I do have my eye on the chat. And if you would like to, please indicate, you take yourself off mute, indicate that you'd like to say so. I'm really happy to make this interactive and for you to ask questions as we go along. At the end of this session, you will receive a post-event email from us with some of the resources that I talk about today, as well as the slides. So please don't feel like you need to write lots of things down. You will get some notes from us about the workshop today. Okay, let's get into it. Now, I'm on the lands of the Yugara and Turrbal people. I'm in West End in Bruinspan or Meanjin, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge their continuing connection to this place and this space, including their connection with the waterways and the land. Of course, I'm extending that acknowledgement to all the lands that you are coming from today. And it's great for me to get an idea of where across Queensland you're coming from. So if you can put in the chat the lands that you're acknowledging or the organisation you're working for, that gives me a great idea of the kinds of services that we've got represented in the workshop. Okay. Now, how confident do you feel about writing a tender application? Sometimes we have people engaging in these webinars who have written many, many tenders and are maybe looking for a few more tips, spanning to those who have never written a tender before and would really like to know where to start. So has anyone written a tender before who's on the line? You can just put your hand up if you like, or indicate in the chat whether or not you've written a tender and how confident you feel about writing a tender. Or has anyone written a Skilling Queenslanders for Work tender before? Yes, great. We've got someone who's written one before. Now, how confident are you in writing a tender? I can see Deb's writing a message. I can't seem to see the messages that you're oh, here we're coming through. They're coming through now. You got your first tender. Great, but that doesn't mean you're extremely confident. Somewhat, that's fair. And look, I think as funding becomes more competitive, Skilling Queenslanders for Work has been around for a while now, and more organisations respond to it every funding round. So it's really good to refine, even if you've been successful previously, to refine what you're writing. And as the years have gone on, I've been involved in writing many different tenders over the years, and certainly the expectations and some of the processes have been refined over that time. For example, and one thing that we will talk about as we go through the webinar is word restrictions or character restrictions, or even the portals that you're asked to use to submit tenders. So this landscape's always changing, and it's great to be able to get some tips about how to refine that, even if you have been successful previously. Thank you, Deb, but you've started writing tenders for Emergency Australia but not confident. Okay, that's great, because there will be quite a few things that you will be able to take from the workshop today. Thank you for your responses. So the workshop today, I'm going to talk a little bit about Skilling Queenslanders for Work. And I will note too that we focus on Skilling Queenslanders for Work as our context for these webinars and for our workshops. But the processes and the tips that we talk about will be relevant across many applications. And as I said, you'll receive a copy of the presentation and the resources that I talk about. Right at the end of the workshop, we're going to talk very briefly about human rights and child safe responsibilities as an obligation that you have if you do receive funding from the Queensland government. So just a few little things at the end of the workshop to be aware of. So the overview, the purpose of the organisation really is to help you prepare and present an effective Skilling Queenslanders for Work application and improve your likelihood of success in gaining this funding or whatever funding it is that you're applying for. To share strategies and resources to support tender applications, and strategies and resources in light of feedback that we've gotten from DESBA and our own organisational experience of writing tenders. Now, Mission Australia used to put out research into grant writing, and this is a little old, it's 2017 and 2018, but these reports do highlight common problems and lessons in grant writing, including that a majority of people started applications that they didn't finish or submit, which indicates a few things. It indicates a greater time's needed for preparation, and reviewing grant requirements prior to starting the application is a good idea. There's quite a few organisations who have started to write or put quite a bit of effort into starting an application before finding out when they read the fine print that this is not actually something that they're going to be successful in applying for because they don't meet those eligibility requirements, which is a real shame and a real waste of time. Now, another interesting thing that this research highlighted, and I think this might be of interest for those of you who've said you aren't overly confident in writing tenders, and that's that they found that professional grant writers didn't win more grants. I think that's really interesting, and I can take a guess at why that might be. I think that's because organisations know their work and what they do intimately well, and they are best placed to write about the value of their relationships with stakeholders and the work that they do. Professional grant writers who aren't embedded in your organisation may not necessarily have the intimate knowledge of your organisation to do it justice when they write about your capacity as an organisation. Many tenders also require us to talk about our practice as organisations, so what kind of programs we deliver, how we deliver those programs, maybe what practice frameworks inform those programs, and that's something that someone who's not embedded in the sector or in your organisation, they may not be able to be to write comprehensively about that. So even if you're not confident, please rest assured that community organisations do have the capacity to write about their organisations and your capability really well and can be really successful in receiving funding. Okay. Now, I would like to talk about the Grant on a Page resource. Now, let me drop this into the chat so I can show you exactly what it is I'm talking about. Hopefully some of you have two screens and you're able to open this up on the side. If you don't, please don't worry. We will also send this to you in email and you can print it off as many times as you like. Organisations I speak to like to print it out in A3 size because that gives them enough room to be able to write on the page. You'll find it's double-sided too, so there's a checklist on the back. I will come back to this throughout the workshop and speak more about this particular resource. But before I do that, before we delve into the content of the tender itself, let's talk a little bit about Skilling Queenslanders for Work as an opportunity if this is something that you're looking to apply for. So some of you may have attended the Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders webinar where we went through this information, or you may have attended a regional information session with Desbert. Now, if you have in-depth questions about Skilling Queenslanders for Work as a funding opportunity, do highly recommend you speak to your regional Desbert team, because they will be able to answer all of your questions. In fact, they recommend that all organisations looking to apply for Skilling Queenslanders for Work funding do get in touch with them, because they would love to discuss your idea with them before you get going on writing the application itself. So Skilling Queenslanders for Work is an annual investment of $80 million across 8 programs to support up to 15,000 disadvantaged Queenslanders into work. So important to note here, and this is the case for some funding, though it's a big banner, Skilling Queenslanders for Work, there's actually 8 different programs under Skilling Queenslanders for Work. So you're not just applying for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, you're applying for one of the programs under it, whether it's Back to Work, the community skills. There's lots of different banners under there. Lots of different programs under there. Now, overall, though, across all of those programs, the commitment of Skilling Queenslanders for Work and the intent of the Queensland Government is to increase workforce participation, job growth, economic strength, and community-led projects. And it's founded on partnerships between community-based organisations and local employers. So if you're a community-based organisation, you are the lead in this work. It's really you who is not only designing the program, but delivering as well. So it's some important things to note about Skilling Queenslanders for Work. It's intended to be tailored, locally based, community supported programs to support young people, mature age job seekers, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, people with disability, women re-entering the workforce, the Australian Defence Force veterans, recently incarcerated people, and people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So a lot of scope there to work with many of the different groups that the community organisations already work with in their day-to-day work. Further funding has been dedicated to community recovery projects for local job seekers in flood-affected areas. You know, being Queensland, we have quite a few different areas that have been affected by natural disaster. Now, at Skilling Queenslanders for Work, it's characterised by clearly defined target groups, voluntary participation, that's really important. So all participants who engage in Skilling Queenslanders for Work have applied to do so. They're not being mandated to do that. And it's an integrated mix of assistance with strong support for participants. So in delivering Skilling Queenslanders for Work projects, what we are mindful of is that the target groups here are those who have been experienced disadvantage in the workforce for many varied reasons. And this is a recognition that community-based organisations are well placed to work with those people to understand their needs and to provide the wraparound support they do need to have success in the workforce. Any questions about Skilling Queenslanders for Work before I move on? Please just let me know. I will keep my eye on the chat. So what are funders looking for in applications? This is a really important question to ask yourself regardless of what funding that you are applying for. So if Desbert is looking at grant applications, what would they like to see? And if those who have applied for funding before have received feedback, have you ever received critical feedback that's really important for you to use in your future applications? So Desbert have let us know that they're looking for community-based organisations who approach projects with the intent to provide genuine support and assistance to participants. So really important to acknowledge that this is not just about delivering a learning program, and it's not just about providing support to participants. It's about providing both of those things at the same time to ensure not only success in the learning and completing whatever the scope is for learning, whether it's a qualification or some other skills, along with preparing someone for longevity in the workforce. So it's not just about getting any job that might not last very long because it's not a good match, but it's about providing all the wraparound support that someone might need to have longevity in their career, longevity in the workforce. So the funder, the Department of Small Business and Training, is looking for applications that demonstrate that the community organisation understands the intent of the SKU programs. So they want to be able to see that you're developing the skills of disadvantaged Queenslanders or people who are underutilised or underemployed in the labour market, and building the skills of people who are in the target groups that they've set out. They want to see in your application that you're going to be providing assistance to people who need support to enter and stay in the workforce. They want to see training and assessment strategies that support the needs of disadvantaged learners. Obviously, if people have been have not successfully completed training or education, have not been able to successfully stay in the workforce, there are many, sometimes complex reasons for that. And so they want to see that you as a community organisation really understand those needs of people that you're working with. They want to see that you as an organisation have legitimate and established employer engagement strategies in place, so that you really do have genuine connection with employers in your local area who will hopefully be able to give people a job at the end of your program. So training for training's sake is not acceptable. Projects have to be driven by the community organisation's understanding of the cohort that they would like to work with, and that cohort's specific barriers to employment, not driven by the RTO. Hopefully we've got some Star Wars fans in the group this afternoon. So we use R2D2 and C3PO to help remind us of a methodology to approach tenders with. So here we go. We've got R2D2. So we've got 2 R's and 2 D's. This is the methodology that we use for preparing to write. We're going to talk about a reference library and review requirements. We're going to talk about developing a plan and drafting responses. So that's our 2 R's and our 2 D's, R2D2. Then when we're actually writing the application, we've got 3 C's, a P and an O. We're going to write clearly, concisely, comprehensively. Now, writing comprehensively and concisely, that might seem like it's an impossibility, but I will talk to you about how to do that. And then lastly, persuasively and on point. So that's how we're going to remember our writing tips this afternoon. So let's start with first R, the reference library. Now, some of you in your organisations may already use something like this. Now, the idea of a reference library is to create a single point of truth for key information in your organisation. And the whole purpose of this is to avoid that mad scramble for key information like your financial statements, your insurance certificate, and potentially missing a deadline if someone who holds that key information is unavailable. So many of us will work in small organisations, and you may have experienced this before when you need something really important and that person just isn't in that day. There's been something unfortunate that's happened and they're unexpectedly away from work, unwell, got some kind of emergency going on, and you do miss a deadline because you're just not able to get that information from that person. It may be that you just didn't expect that person was going to be on leave. They might not even be in the country. They might be on a holiday and you didn't realise that next week on Friday when that grant application is due, they're actually not going to be here for the week at all and you've missed that. So we encourage you to create a reference library where you would keep the information that are generally used for most tender writing. I'll just go back here for 1 second for that video plays, but it's really key information like your some of the things we talk about are resumes. Many grant applications these days ask for key staff resumes. If you are already delivering a Skilling Queenslanders for Work program, you could use a resume of the people you've already got employed to deliver Skilling Queenslanders for Work. But if you do not have, if it's a program that you would need to do a fresh recruitment for, you might need to use a position description, for example. Insurance certificates, all of those kinds are the kinds of things that you would have in a grant reference library, and it can make life much easier, particularly if you're applying for multiple grants over the year. Now let's try our luck and see if this video works. I hope it does. Can you all hear that? Right. So you just heard that's one of our team members, Kelly, who works on the Skilling Queenslanders for Work, and there are many short videos available on the QCOS website, and there's a few more embedded in this webinar. Hopefully that gave you a bit of a idea of the kinds of things you could keep in that single source of truth folder for your future grant applications. So the next R in the R2D2 process is reviewing the requirements. And this is really important because it is such a shame when someone dedicates time and resources to starting to fill out an application or even spend time thinking about a program or project design when they realise down the line that they're not actually eligible for that funding. Now, the Grant in Australia report that Mission Australia wrote found that more than 2 in every 5 respondents who had started but not finished an application stopped the application because they realised that the program wasn't right for them or they didn't meet the eligibility criteria. This could have been avoided if they had thoroughly reviewed and considered the requirements before starting their application. So we do really recommend you always read carefully through the funding guidelines all the way through before you start an application. And that's not, there's no shortcut to that, unfortunately. It's just something you need to do to make sure that this is the right funding for your organisation. So for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, what we need to consider is your organisation's purpose, values, your core business, your area of experience and your area of expertise, how you currently work with clients, what existing client groups and stakeholders and community links you have. I will note here the risk of applying for funding where the program does not align with your organisation's purpose and core business. So if that's the case, and sometimes we do get, concerned about resourcing and we're pursuing different ways of resourcing the organisation, but it can be really challenging when an application doesn't align with your organisation's core purpose. 2 things can happen. One is that your application really doesn't end up very well written because you can't confidently speak to what the application's asking you for because it is a bit left field for your organisation, doesn't really fit with what you typically do. But the other risk is that the application is successful and your organisation struggles to deliver it because it is really a mismatch with your organisation's core business. Now, that's not to say that organisations shouldn't branch out and do different things and evolve. Absolutely not discouraging organisations from evolving, but you do need to be able to be confident that your organisation can deliver what you are saying you can deliver. So that's the only word of caution I would share about that. If any of our colleagues from DESVA are on the line, please jump in at any point and make comments here too. Really keen to hear from you. All right, so we're going to step through some of the grant on a page, if you've got that up on your screen, facets as we go through the workshop. So this one here is a project idea. Now, do any of you have a project idea or intent to apply for Skilling Queenslanders for Work in this round? And if you do, I'm going to ask whether or not you might consider telling us about your project idea. Anyone looking to apply for it this time around? Or currently delivering a Skilling Queenslanders for Work project? Anyone currently delivering something? Okay, no one's putting their hand up at the moment. So what I'm going to do is share with you the Skilling Queenslanders for Work website, where there are some great examples. And if you've gone to the information, the Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders for Work information session, there were many sample projects shared during that session. The recording is on the QCOS website where you can see what projects are currently being delivered successfully. Now, I find that's a really useful way to tease out your own ideas as an organisation as to what you might be able to deliver. And that, if that information is available for other funding, that can be a really useful way to workshops and brainstorm some ideas, because the scope is really quite wide for Skilling Queenslanders for Work. So what I find is when we look at successfully run projects under Skilling Queenslanders for Work, it's a great way of just generating what might be possible for your own organisation in your own context with the community that you're delivering to. So I really recommend jumping on the Skilling Queenslanders for Work website. I'm getting tongue twisted because I've got QCOS in my head too. Going onto their funded project list. And there is actually a map there that you can use, and you can have a look at what's currently being delivered in your area and under the different funded programs. So do recommend checking that out. Okay, now, if you're looking at Skilling Queenslanders for Work, these are the questions I would really like you to ask yourself before you proceed to the next section. Check that there's an alignment between the core business of your organisation and the funding purpose. Think about the community or cohort among the program's target to recruit and whether or not that aligns with your organisation and what you currently deliver to community. You need to have a good understanding of what you'll need to do if the application is successful. See whether or not you have existing relationships with potential participants and RTO. So have you worked with a registered training organisation before? What does that relationship look like? Are you embarking on a new partnership? What work might need to be done to establish that? Do you have existing relationships with employers and other services to meet program requirements? Because some of this, of meeting the needs of your participants, might include referring to other organisations, making sure, if that's not a need your organisation can support, but you've recognised that your participant does have a need, what organisations would you refer them to ensure that that's fulfilled? How familiar are you with the services that other organisations in your region provide? And do you have the ability to appoint or quickly recruit appropriately skilled and experienced staff? That's a really important one to consider for Skilling Queenslanders for Work. If you don't already deliver a project under SKU and you would need to recruit someone to coordinate your SKU program, what does that look like? Do you have someone in mind? Do you have a position description ready to go? All of those kinds of things. Now, if you are embarking on a relationship with an RTO, we do really recommend you have a MOU to solidify that partnership. There's many, and we'll talk a little more about some of the conversations you might need to have with an RTO or other partner organisations you're working with. Do you have record keeping systems that you will need for the required reporting? Now, Skilling Queenslanders for Work has monthly reporting that you would need to submit to DESBIT. So there's lots of considerations here before you start actually putting pen to paper or opening up the portal, as you have to do with this application, making sure that you're able to answer all of these things before you start dedicating any more time. Okay, so participants, again, going back to those sample projects or thinking about your program that you might have in mind, your project idea that you started to work on, what cohorts would you be working with? It's really important to be working with stakeholders that you have established experience working with, whether or not that's young people, older people, culturally and linguistically diverse, etc. Ensuring this is probably not the project where you would embark on a totally new stakeholder group that you have never worked with before, because in your application you will need to establish that you have experience working with them, you really understand deeply their needs. So Deb, you're just asking what the relationship looks like. So yes, the community organisation is the lead organisation for Skilling Queenslanders for Work and must be the one making the application, and they need to partner with an RTO. That's right. So if you're an RTO, you would be looking for a community organisation to partner with if you would like to deliver a Skilling Queenslanders for Work. And this workshop will give you quite a bit of information about what kinds of needs a community-based organisation will have with that RTO. Now, thinking about back to the grant on a page resource again, thinking about impact. What is the impact or hope for outcomes of our project? And you can see how you might be able to use this grant on a page resource to brainstorm any projects you're really seeking funding for. So we've talked about the project idea. What is it that we're looking to do? Then we're going to think about, what would be the short-term impacts and long-term outcomes of the project we're seeking to deliver. Yes, we're going to deliver training, and yes, we're going to get people jobs. But what does, as far as impact for those participants goes and for our community, what does that look like? Next, you'd be thinking about, and hopefully you have this page when you're doing this brainstorming before you start actually typing out any responses, you have it printed out and you've been able to jot down these things with some of your colleagues. What's our value add? So organisations, this is something that in the not-for-profit space we could be better at, definitely, is thinking about what value we add to the work. So why would Desbert fund you and not the organisation down the road to do this? So if they're looking at many applications across the board, what would stand out for them with your organisation? Why would you be the organisation that they would resource to deliver a project? So really thinking about all of the things your organisation does day in, day out, and what makes your organisation unique and particularly well placed to deliver the project that you're putting forward. It might be that you have really strong relationships with early childhood service in the area who might be able to assist with getting casual childcare places for women who would like to be studying and getting back into the workforce but just haven't been able to navigate that childcare space. That's just one example off the top of my head of particular relationships and values that organisations can add to this process. And I'm sure you will be able to, if you're coming from a community-based organisation, will be able to think of many of the values that your organisation, value adds that your organisation has. Other examples would include, and this gets into in-kind support now, so what kinds of things that your organisation can add to the mix that would have even a financial value. Things like your assets. Like you have an established transport mechanism. You own a minibus and you're able to use that to transport people. That's a real value add for an organisation in delivering a project like this. All of those kinds of things, thinking about what your organisation has to offer. Another really important one, resourcing. So what kinds of things will you need to deliver this project, whether it's Skilling Queenslanders work or another program you're looking to resource? What does it cost? And this is another, yes, Deb, thank you. Supplying a training room, that's a value add. That's something that you could provide in kind. That's a really common one for Skilling Queenslanders work, particularly if you're a neighbourhood centre or a similar organisation. The fact that you have a training room so that they don't need to actually pay for a training room makes all the difference. Writing down and brainstorming all the resources that you will need to deliver the project is a really important one. Often budget gets left to last when you're writing a tender, which is fine. That's understandable because as you go along, you will think of extra things that you need to be putting into that budget. But what sometimes happens when the resourcing aspect of an application is rushed, what might happen is things do get missed. And what we don't want to see is organisations then in the red at the end of delivering their project because they didn't actually ask for adequate resourcing. And that's a really important one to be thinking about at the moment too. The costs of most things have risen, so it's really important that organisations are thinking about costs right now, so not basing your budget on last year's budget or the year before that, but thinking fresh about how much things are going to cost. And we will talk a little bit more about budgets soon. Okay, now into the Ds, now into developing your plan. So the Skilling Queenslanders for Work website, which is run by Desbert, has lots of information to assist you in writing your application. Now, I find their guide to applying for funding, which we will put in the email, a really user-friendly document. It's a really good one that sets out very clearly what you need to be incorporating into your application. There's lots of fact sheets about all of the Skilling Queenslanders for Work programs, depending on which one you think you might like to apply for. And again, if you're not sure, please contact your regional DESBT office because they would love to chat to you about that. There is a sample services agreement. So if you are successful, there's a sample agreement for you to look at. So you know exactly what kinds of thing you'll be asked to sign if you're successful in gaining the funding. There's the application portal, of course. That's a really important one to get familiar with because that's what you will be using to apply for the funding. There's user support guides and there's lots of frequently asked questions. So please go on there, have a look at the fact sheets. The fact sheets include things like what your expected outcomes or KPIs are, what is and isn't eligible for funding. So if you're looking at a budget, you can see, okay, this particular thing is not eligible for funding. So we would need to find a partner or a sponsor, or we would need to contribute that ourselves as an organisation to incorporate into the program. On all these things here are funded, these things aren't. You can be really clear about what you can put into your budget and what you cannot put into your budget. Next on the grant on a page resource, we're thinking about key partners. So we've put this into the developing a plan aspect of the preparing for your tender because partnerships, that stuff can take a lot of time. So as community organisations, you will already undoubtedly have strong relationships with many organisations. Not only, you would have many relationships in your local area, but you would also know of organisations you can refer to that may be outside of your local area and other partnerships that you would leverage from. So when you're developing your timeline for putting your tender together, and for any funding opportunity that does have partnership as a key cornerstone of the funding, it's really important to leave yourself enough time to develop those partnerships. So do we already have those partnerships and we just need to get in touch and then sort out the details? Or have we identified that there are partners that we need who we do not currently have a relationship with, or not really a close working relationship that we need to set some time aside to actually build? Now, for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, you do need letters of support. Now, I'll talk about those in greater detail as we get further along through the workshop, but I want to flag that because getting letters of support can also take some time. It needs to be current letters of support on that organisation's letterhead or on that business's letterhead, and they need to be detailed enough that they include the details of the project. So if you see now, if you've got an application that's due in a week's time, it's really hard to very quickly establish partnerships, get letters of support, and do all those things in a short period of time. So we've put it here into the developer plan part of building out your timeline, because you will need to flag if there's some work to be done in developing those key partnerships. But I am sure that you have quite a few partnerships to leverage from as it is. Okay, now this is a funny experience for me because I'm facilitating and then I'm in this video too. So this one is all about your key points for partnering with an RTO. So Deb, this will be of interest for you because this is what a community-based organisation will be looking for from you. So here we go. Hopefully that gave you a good idea. That's a very quick snapshot, but there's some of the things that you need to be mindful of when establishing your partnerships, particularly with your RTO. Now, being in Queensland, we will all have experienced what natural disaster season can, and sometimes outside of natural disaster season, can mean for us. So, I've heard of Skilling Queenslanders for Work projects where, fire or flood or cyclone, etc., have interrupted delivery schedules. So it's really important when you're speaking to potential RTOs or other partners who might be contributing part of either wraparound support or the training delivery to your participants, that you have a conversation about things like that. How flexible are we? What would we do if this particular thing happened? So we have a delivery schedule, but what kind of mitigation do we have for if we can't keep to that? A really important conversation to have with RTOs, and I've heard many organisations kind of lament the fact that they didn't bring this up right at the beginning, is some RTOs will have minimum class sizes. If you're a really small organisation and you are in a small regional area and you actually only want to deliver a program to 10 people, is that enough for the RTO? They might have minimum class requirements. What's the plan if you're not able to recruit as many participants as you thought originally and you do have a smaller class size? Is that going to be a problem with your RTO, or do you have a plan to mitigate that? How flexible can they be? And what does that actually look like? So they're all really important questions to be navigating right at the beginning of this partnership process, so that you're not caught out at the other end if your project is successful and those unexpected things might happen. So working relationships have to be continuously developed and maintained. So many funding opportunities require partnerships and connections with other service providers. This is certainly not just something that you'd be looking at for Skilling Queenslanders for Work. I think just about all funding applications I fill out these days require some level of partnership and letter of support to detail that. Developing relationships with potential funders can support the tender development. So for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, the Department of Employment Small Business Training are really clear that they're very happy to hear from organisations. So they would love to talk to you about your project idea. In fact, they've definitely said to me on a number of occasions they would prefer not to get applications from organisations that they had no idea that they were developing the application. So they want to be able to talk to you before you actually get to the point where you're submitting an application. Establishing those working relationships allows for a much quicker establishment of your project and writing the tender itself, and it assists in identifying and solving problems early. So like I said, if something does pop up like, oh, actually the RTO requires a minimum class size, and we've talked about it beforehand, we can have a plan for making sure that we meet that. That's not a detail you want to emerge after you're already successful and after you're delivering the project, and then you get to a bit of a problem with meeting your participant program size. If you had no idea that the RTO had a minimum class requirement, that would be a problem. But if you're starting these conversations nice and early, that's the kind of thing that you can have a discussion around and mitigate the risk of early on. Now, the good thing about Skilling Queenslanders for Work, one of the good things about Skilling Queenslanders for Work, is this is a recurring funding opportunity. So if right now you're listening to this and you're thinking, I'm not sure that we're going to have these relationships ready for this round, the good news is there will be a second round. So this is only the first round of the financial year. Come February, March, there will be another round that you will be able to utilise. So if you don't think those relationships are quite where they need to be at this stage for this funding round, I would really encourage you to start doing that relationship building now so that you're well prepped for next time. And the other part of developing your timeline for your tender is your project team. So who needs to be part of your project team? Now, if you're in a really small organisation, you might think, well, I'm the only one writing it and I'm going to be delivering it too. But there's nearly always other people who need to be involved in this in this project delivery. So in writing the tender itself, there's going to be probably people in the organisation that you do need documents from. There might be administrative or finance staff that you might need audited financial statements from, or perhaps insurance certificates and that kind of information from. What would be great to have is in someone internally to review your writing. And most organisations, I would say, would have some kind of approval process. I know for me personally, I cannot just apply for funding on behalf of QCOS and submit it without anyone else having a look at it. That's not how the approval process here works. There's a process to follow. For some small organisations, you might even need to have the chair of your board or your president of your management committee look at funding applications before you submit it. Totally depends on what your approval processes are. But the point I'm trying to make here is that you need to let other people know what you're working on and make sure they understand what you need from them and when you need it from them. So again, going back to that scenario of someone unexpectedly being away, whether or not you just didn't know they were going on leave, or if it's an unexpected emergency that means they're not at work, being caught out if you didn't know that they were going to be away, you won't be able to get all the information that you need to submit your tender. So it's really important to let those people know that you are working on a tender and what you need from them and when you'll need it from them. So if those unexpected things come up, you have a plan. And of course, external stakeholders may have a role in writing the tender too, because you will need letters of support from them. You will need possibly an MOU with an RTO. So there will be different people that you'll need to involve in this process. A grant application is not usually something that you can just go away and write by yourself without having anyone contribute to it. Now, if you're successful, of course, there's lots of people involved in this. There's internal staff and management. There's referrers, so organisations who you've spoken to, who you want them to refer participants to you. So you might say, look, we're going to be delivering this great program to young people between 15 and 25, and we're going to be delivering this qualification. It's going to run in between these dates. And you would be telling other community organisations that work with that cohort that you're doing that so that they can refer participants to you. You'd be talking to service providers, making sure that they know what it is that you are delivering, and if they're organisations that you can refer your participants to. So you might not deliver housing support, for example, as an organisation, but you might have recognised that some of the cohort that you're going to be working with will need housing support. So getting familiar with who you would be referring to them to that, because all of the wraparound support that they receive as participants will lead to the success of your program. If they're well supported through all the referrals that you're able to give them, you will have much more success and be able to deliver the program to them and having them complete the program and having them go into employment. And of course, the other people who are involved are those external stakeholders, the community members. So for example, potential employers. These are all the different people who will be involved if you are successful in getting the resourcing. So I would recommend, and we do this in our organisation, is when we're going to be working on a big thing like this, we get a tender team together. So it doesn't need to be a really long meeting, but it's just getting those initial people together. Maybe your finance person, maybe your admin person, maybe your manager, the person that might be delivering the project. You will have a good idea of the people in your organisation you need to involve. Just getting them all together, going through the roles, expectations. When is the tender due? When do we need a draft by? Who's got relationships with those external stakeholders who can approach them for a letter of support, for example? So just determining all of those roles and all those responsibilities and who's going to be doing those things. And this is where you would be assigning jobs to team members. So you're thinking about, okay, who in the team has that in-depth program delivery or practice knowledge, who would be able to actually help design the program that we're going to put forward? Who's the person that has those relationships with those external stakeholders and who can ask them for letters of support? All of those kinds of things. So we would recommend finding your due date and working backwards from that and scheduling in all of your different milestones. So, if it's due on the 30th of September, we know our CEO or president or chair needs 5 days to approve, so we need to get it to them on the 25th. That's just an example of how you would be working backwards from the due date to make sure you've got adequate time. So you aren't one of those organisations that is caught out not getting to submit because you ran out of time. Going through this process of actually marking out on a calendar too really is helpful for recognizing, sometimes we think about, oh yeah, that's due in 6 weeks and that feels like plenty of time. But if you go through the calendar and actually start mapping it out of when you need a draft by and when you need the letters of support by and when you need this and that, it will really help you recognize things like, school holidays and, that person's on leave for a week during there, so actually we're going to need it then. It really helps you map out where some of the challenges might be with the timing. So it's a useful process to go through for any funding that you're working on. Okay, now this is where we start to, when we're thinking about our project idea and what we're going to write in our tender, this is where we're starting to think about that really fun stuff, the stuff that your organisation does on a day-to-day basis that is useful for participants, that wraparound support that's helpful for participants. So love it if you could put in the chat, if you're an organisation that maybe does deliver Skilling Queenslanders for work, what kinds of core project activities or outputs you might deliver as a project for your organisation. So some of those things might be, so there are so many great supports that organisations deliver. So thinking about some of the Skilling Queenslanders for Work projects I've seen, some of them they identify that they're working with people who for whom transport is just a huge barrier to being able to maintain work, and so they help them get their learner's license. It might be paperwork. The whole issue of applying for a tax file number and getting a blue card, that kind of thing, that might be the barrier. So they help participants do that. There are all kinds. It may be a confidence issue for someone actually just getting out there, turning up to an interview, maintaining employment. And so for some, in some programs, there's been a lot of life skill, confidence building activities that happen. We've seen lots of different great photos of projects being delivered, ropes courses, first aid, all kinds of things that, again, I would jump on the Skilling Queenslanders for Work DESBIT website to have a look at funded projects currently, because that gives you a great idea of what kinds of things organisations deliver. And of course, the importance of evaluation. Now, this is really important across any funding that you're applying for. Now, I mentioned earlier that Skilling Queenslanders for Work requires monthly reporting, which is quite good because it does force you just to keep on top of your reporting so it doesn't pile up. But with any funding that you're applying for, it's really important to consider, what would it look like if this was successful? So what would we consider success? And for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, the different funding projects that are available are quite clear in the guidelines what they would consider success to be. So there's actually KPIs, like percentages of of how many participants they would expect you do successfully deliver the training to, and how many of them who have jobs at the end of the project. They actually have that mapped out. So there's no guesswork for Skilling Queenslanders for Work as far as like what would be acceptable and successful for the department. They have very clearly stated that in the funding guidelines. So if you're unsure, please talk to the regional DESBIT team. Let them know what you'd like to deliver and what numbers you're thinking, and they will let you know what would be an acceptable KPI. That's really important because that sets us up for funding in the future. If we successfully deliver a project, that's great. We can use that as evidence as our capacity to deliver as an organisation. When we are not clear about what success looks like and we don't adequately evaluate our work, sometimes we do great work, but if we don't measure it, it's really hard to use that as evidence for future funding opportunities. So really, really important that community organisations adequately evaluate the work that they do. And here we go. Here's a little video about evaluating your project. Thank you very much for your chat that's happening there. That's some great clarifying questions being asked. Now, someone has asked whether or not they could deliver a program to those who might be looking to get their plumbing qualifications. So really good question. And I can't encourage you enough to speak to your regional team. On the Desbert website, there is contact details there to speak to your regional teams. It's really important to get in touch with them to talk about eligibility and your project idea, and they will let you know not only what program to apply for, because remember there's eight programs under Skilling Queenslanders work. They will be able to recommend which program to apply for, but also give you some tips to guide how you design your program. Okay, so on the second page of the Grant on a Page website, you'll notice that there's actually a checklist to help you with making sure you've got all the things that you need to apply via the portal. So we've had a look at the milestones and key dates. We've thought about what outcomes we're seeking through our project and what those KPIs might look like, and that is dependent on what program you apply for under Skilling Queenslanders work. But thinking about what outcomes we seek is really important so that we don't overpromise and underdeliver. So obviously, given you are held to a KPI, so a percentage that deems you to be successful with Skilling Queenslanders work. If you're a small organisation delivering a barista qualification or hospitality qualification in a small town, saying that you're going to get 100 people qualified and into jobs is probably not realistic. So it really helps to think about what could we realistically deliver. It's always better to underpromise and overdeliver than to do the opposite. Thinking about what your key requirements as an organisation are, what your tender team looks like. So does everyone in our organisation who will be working or have any role in contributing to this tender know that we're working on it and what they are expected to do? And we've had a look at our checklist of inclusions, and we make sure that we've got all the things that we need. So before advancing to drafting your responses, a prospective Skilling Queenslanders for Work provider should be able to answer all of these questions. So this is for any of you who would like to deliver a Skilling Queenslanders for Work project. These are the kinds of questions you should be able to answer before you start writing the application. What is the project? How will it benefit the community? Who's your cohort? How will you recruit? Do you already have programs that you deliver to these groups of people, or do you need another avenue to recruit people? What jobs will participants be eligible for? Are there employers in your local area who could give people jobs afterwards? These are all the kinds of things you need to have thought out. And hopefully that Grant on a Page resource helps you do that. That's what that tool is meant to be for. It's meant for you to print out, sit down with it and start jotting down all of these things so you can get really clear before you start writing. When you're clear about all these things, the writing part becomes so much easier, because if you can't answer these questions before you start writing, you're going to have a really hard time keeping to your word count. You're not going to be able to write comprehensively and succinctly. You will probably do what we call waffle on because you aren't really clear about what you're saying. Now, the other benefit of brainstorming in this way and using that Grant on a Page tool is having these conversations with your partner organisations. So using a tool like this and answering these questions together will really help you identify where you're actually not on the same page. So you thought you're on the same page, you thought you both had the same idea about what you wanted to do together, but through answering these questions, you actually might start to discover there are some parts of the project you don't have total clarity around. So really useful to use all these questions, particularly with your partners. And now we're to drafting the actual responses. Again, there's so much work that leads up until this point, but there's really no shortcut, because if you jump straight to drafting responses, there's a lot of thinking that's done along the way that you will have skipped, and you will find the writing part quite difficult. So I promise the writing part will be a lot quicker if you've done all of these things before you actually get to this part here. Now, when we get to the writing stage, it's really important to remember you're not writing a novel. It is fundamentally different. So in creative writing, you're establishing the context, you're establishing the characters, you're setting a scene, you've got a storyline, a plot, twists, mystery, conflict, and a climax at the end. Grant writing is fundamentally different. We need key messages, supporting points, and examples, data, and evidence really clearly there so that the funding assessor is able to very clearly see what you're trying to communicate. So this is a really important tip for the way that you write. Now, responding to the assessment criteria is the largest part of your writing effort. And we're going to step through now what the assessment criteria for Skilling Queenslanders for Work is. So when you get to this writing part, you'll know exactly what it is that they're looking for you to say. Now, responding to the assessment criteria effectively does depend on effective planning. So that whole R2D2 process that we talked about preparing properly, that will make this a lot easier. Now, it's important to know that your responses will be used to score and rank proposals. So Skilling Queensland, and this is similar pretty much across the board. Most funders use this process now, but they will have a scoring matrix. I think it's out of 100, where each criteria is going to be scored separately. Those scores are put together. This is a competitive funding round. So really it just means that the top, however many scored funding proposals just go to the top and the others won't get funded. So every response really does count. Even a difference of 1 point between applications can make a difference as to whether or not you do get funded or not. So in brief, this is what the SKU assessment criteria looks like. So when you create a login in this Skilling Queenslanders for Work portal, these are the different criteria you're going to have to respond to. So some key points here is undertaking a solid process will mean that by this point, you have a really clear sense of your capacity to meet these criteria and have documents and plans on hand that can demonstrate this. The next process is writing an application that demonstrates these criteria. So what you're doing is taking all of your ideas and all the knowledge you have about your organisation and making sure you put it into a really clear response for the funder to read. Now, there's 2 stages to the way that DESBIT assesses all of these applications. So at the end of the funding round, the portal closes and everyone's submitted their applications, and there's a 2-part assessment process. Stage 1 is that DESBIT goes through the capacity to manage criteria, and the applicant must demonstrate a capacity to manage in order to proceed. So in this top criteria here, where you have to establish your financial, operational, and governance viability as an organisation, if they aren't able to demonstrate that you have capacity to manage funding, the Skilling Queenslanders for Work funding, they do not read the rest of your application. So it's really, and this is similar for other funding opportunities too, it's very, very important. I can't tell you how important it is to make sure that you do carefully write about your capacity to manage, because all the rest of your efforts will be null and void if you can't get past that first assessment stage. So it's very important to make sure you put your best effort into all of your responses. So let's assume you all get past that stage, your capacity to manage, then your application will be read in its entirety, and the rest of your application will get scored. Then all of the applications are ranked according to their scores. And again, this is pretty similar to the way that it works in most funding environments. So in the assessment criteria, we need to be really clear what's being asked and what needs to be included in my response. You need to put your key messages up first. So think about what's most important for you to say and make sure you say that first. Be clear, concise, and comprehensive. Now, one tip is to avoid answering criteria by referring to information in the other criteria, because different people sometimes assess the different questions. So make sure you don't refer too much to other parts of your application. And really important is to provide evidence to back up your claims. So if you're writing something, the onus is on you as a writer to make sure you have some kind of evidence for that. So you are putting references into your application. So if you're talking about, oh, according to this report, or there's been research done that shows this in our community, you need to actually say where you got that from. So if you log on to the portal, this is what it will look like. This is a screenshot from the Skilling Queenslanders for Work online portal for the community work skills application. That's a really good question. So Zia, you've asked for capacity managed, what to say if you've never had a grant before. Now your response to this will be dependent on your organisation. So you will need to be able to, you do need to have 2 years of audited financial statements. If you don't have that, if your organisation hasn't existed for 2 years and you don't have 2 years worth of financial statements to submit, you need to talk to Desbert about how to get around that. There may be circumstances where they're able to accept that, but you need to talk to them about what to give to them instead. If you've never had a grant before, you'll need to talk about things like, well, we'll get capacity to manage. We can get into this now, actually. How would you actually respond to this? You can see here, you need to attach your audited income and expenditure statements to show your financial viability. You need to attach your staff resumes and any background information to support your application. So if you haven't received this kind of funding before, what you could talk about is the kind of services your organisation has delivered previously, how it is comparable to what you're looking to deliver for Skilling Queenslanders for Work. You can talk about the skills and experience of your team members. So using their resumes to talk about, even though we haven't delivered Skilling Queenslanders for Work before or something like this before, we've got a team member who has delivered something similar somewhere else, or we've got extensive experience in doing this particular kind of work. So you need to use this criteria to talk about what you can do, because you're right. All organisations start somewhere. They all have their first funding grant. No organisation has had perpetual funding since the beginning of time. So that's a really fair question. And what I would do is I would speak to your regional Desbert team and ask them what would be helpful to include in that to build their confidence in you as an organisation in delivering this funding. That's great. Thank you very much. We've got some responses here that give some help too. So what your governance structure is, who you have working in the organisation, your audits, any other experience. And this is where that evaluation comes in really handy, because if you've been able to evaluate other work that you've done and how effective the other work that you've done is, that's what you can use to evidence your capacity to manage. But if you never evaluate your work and don't have any evidence for the work that you do, that becomes really difficult. So it's very important whenever we deliver programs that we evaluate them adequately. Now, you will notice here that there is a maximum of 2,800 characters, including spaces and punctuation. That might sound like a lot, but it's really not. It's actually about 350 to 400 words, which is not a lot of writing. So that's why I've been so insistent that you need to do a lot of planning before you get to your writing stage, because you do not have enough word limit to waffle on when you get to writing in your portal. And you'll also notice that you have to write directly into the portal. So most organisations I speak to actually draft this in a Word document. In Word, you can keep an eye on how many characters you're using. They refine it, edit it, proofread, and then when they're totally happy with their answers, they will copy and paste it into the portal. So you'll notice there is a word limit, and that is for all of the criteria. And then you can use your attachments to put more information in there. So as you go through, you can see each criteria. It's really, really clear what attachments you need for each one. So you can see here for capacity to manage, you've got the income expenditure statements, and you've got your staff resumes in there too. So this might be helpful as well as far as evidencing your capacity to manage if you haven't delivered with funding before. Experience in delivering relevant programs, what your core business is as an organisation. So you might be able to talk about the fact that you've not delivered a funded program before, but you have extensive experience working with your participants. And so you have an in-depth knowledge and experience of working with this cohort of people, and that will serve you really well in delivering this program. You'll be able to talk about your staff or team qualifications, skills and experience, your financial viability, your experience managing other programs, even if they weren't funded. All of those kinds of things are what will help evidence your capacity to manage. All right, getting into criteria 2. So we've got 4 plus our budget. So for criteria 2, we are talking about servicing community industry needs. So in this one, an effective response requires the use of community and sector knowledge to demonstrate understanding the skills and labour needs at the local community level and how the project will address these. So this is your opportunity to talk to Desmond about how well you know your community and what employers need. So this is where you'll be able to evidence that you have spoken to employers in your local area. You know that they are looking for people with a particular qualification that you'd like to deliver. You know what the impact will be on your community. You know how this project is responsive to your local community needs. So if you haven't received Skilling Queenslanders for Work funding before, you may not be aware that there is a regional Skilling Queenslanders for Work advisory committee in every region, made up of representatives from that community. So the DESBIT head office looks at all the applications that come in, and firstly, they assess capacity to manage. Once they've decided an application shows that an organisation has capacity to manage, it goes on to the next stage. And this is where these Skilling Queenslanders for Work advisory committees come in. They read the applications for their local region and they give feedback to DESBIT about what projects they think should be funded. They want to see that there's responses that demonstrate local community support. They want to see responses that outline how the project will link with other local initiatives or other services, and that there's links to industry stakeholders, employers. So they don't want to only see that an organisation has the ability to provide referrals and support to participants, but that they will also have those genuine links with potential employers in the local area to get them jobs. So it's really important if you're a large organisation who's looking to deliver in projects across lots of different regions, because sometimes that does happen. A large organisation wants to deliver across Queensland. It's really, really important that your responses for every region that you apply in shows that you have that local knowledge. I think that's an area where some organisations fall down. They make their responses too generic. This is where smaller organisations based in regional areas can really evidence their genuine link to the community. So they've spoken to this employer down the road and that employer down the road. They've got 4 different local employers who said that they will definitely be keen to employ someone with a qualification they're delivering. So this is really your chance in responding to this criteria where you can show that you have those local links. You need letters of support from employers that focus on the project and they commit to providing employment. Now, it doesn't have to be a promise that they definitely will employ someone, but what the letter should say is, as an employer in this area, we would be looking to employ someone with this particular qualification in the next 6 months or whatever the timeline is. So that's the kind of how specific it needs to be. It doesn't need to be a contract where they're definitely committing to employing someone, but it does need to really quite robustly commit to the project. You need letters of support from community organisations that will support participants. So going back again to my example where you as an organisation might not deliver housing support, but you will have a letter of support from an organisation down the road who does do housing support, saying that you have an agreement that they are able to come in and provide support to your participants who have that need. It's really important in your responses. It's really important to show that you know that not all participants need exactly the same thing. So if you're a community organisation with a deep knowledge of the cohort that you're working with, you will know that they don't necessarily all need housing support, or they won't all need special accommodations because they might have literacy or numeracy challenges, or they might not all need an interview outfit. It's really important that you demonstrate in your responses that you understand that your participants will all have unique needs, but that you have enough relationships across the sector to be able to point them in the right direction and get their needs met while they're a participant in your program. So in your response, you really need to talk about the evidence of your organisation's community presence and support, evidence of any collaborations or partnerships you have, that you understand your industry and community needs. Now, there's one thing I'd like to show you here, actually. Some of you who are familiar with QCOS will know that we do support organisations to use data. And this is a really important aspect of your application, is being able to show that you understand what your regional community needs are. So I wanted to show you this because this might be helpful in you writing your application. We do have some community profiles built across Queensland. And if you're in an area where we have done a community profile, and apologies, we haven't been able to do every single town, but if you are in a community that is covered by our regional profiles, you might find them quite useful in writing your application. And if you want to know more about how to use data in your Skilling Queenslanders for Work application, we do have webinars coming up that will help you do that. So I'm going to pop these in the chat, and for anyone who's watching this after the fact, you can find the details of these on our website. So what I've just shared, and I will have this in the post event email, is a link to QCOS's data point. So if you Google QCOS data point, you will find this. And if you Google QCOS community data profiles, you'll find the second link I've put in the chat. The third link I'm going to put in here is the link to our Strengthening Your SKU application with data. If you're interested in that. So if you've recognised that you might need to tighten up your knowledge of your local labour market and industry needs, that might be something to have a look at. That will really strengthen your application. The other thing to say here is if you are an organisation who has been successful in applying for Skilling Queenslanders work or other funding several times, it's really important not to get too complacent with just reusing the same data. So as new data does become available to you, making sure you're updating your applications, making sure you're checking that you're not just delivering the same program over and over again when actually the needs have met, making sure you do go back to those data sources and make sure it's still current. Now, this is some scaffolding to use for your application. So as we've talked about, there's some really strict word restrictions. We need to be really careful that we're not going over. In fact, not only do you have to be careful not to go over the word restriction, the portal won't let you. So you might be typing away, or you might copy and paste. And if your response is too long, it won't actually let you submit it. So you do need to absolutely stick to the character count. So this is a way, I've talked previously about the way that the responses are scored. So when someone is responding to a criteria in a funding application, if you feel really confident in talking about a particular part of the assessment criteria, you may feel tempted to write a lot about that thing that you feel quite confident in talking about. But what will happen is you might get 10 out of 10 for that particular part of the response, but you'll score really low on the other aspects of your response. So hopefully you can all see what I mean when I put up this scaffolding on the screen. So what we're suggesting is if you would like to write a really even response to this selection criteria of servicing community industry needs, you will probably need to write about 100 words talking about the need in your community. Then you will need to use about 100 words talking about the impact that this project would have on your community. Then about 100 words linking the project to the needs of your community. And then about 100 words talking about the local support that's in your community for your project, and you would have letters of support attached for that. So by breaking down, thinking about, okay, in this response, they've asked me these 4 things. Go back here. In this response, they've asked me to look at industry needs and labour needs, impact on the wider community, how the projects are responsive to local community needs. So I need to think about how I'm going to talk about each of those elements evenly so I can get an even score across them, and what evidence I need for each of those points. So you might say, oh, okay, my key message for the need in the community is I'm going to talk about high youth unemployment. I'm going to use the QCOS data profile or data point to find the data I need to say what I need to say about that to establish Desbot's confidence in that as a need in my community. So I'll use some stats, might be ABS data, it might be council data. There's lots of different data sources, and if you come to that webinar, you'll find out more about free data sources you can use to establish your community need. And then you're going to think about what your key message is for impact on community, and etc. So if you do this for every criteria you're working with, even just putting it down in bullet points, and then you can start, what I usually do is I create a Word document, I put all the headings there, and then I just make bullet points under them, like what is my key message that I'm going to say under this one, under this one, under this one, and what evidence do I need? If you're doing that early on, what it also means is you very quickly identify where you don't have evidence for things, which is great because it's really hard to get something like a letter of support or get a particular piece of data if you've only got 2 days left before the thing is due. So if you're mapping this out early on, you're going, okay, I want my key message to be this and my evidence I'll need is this, you will early on realize what bits of data you still need to go and get, and other people or other organizations might be the ones that can help you do that. Hopefully you find that useful. Okay, so now criteria 3. We're looking at strategies to assist participants. So in this response, in your 3rd criteria, you're going to be talking about how you will identify needs and barriers and what strategies. So this is where you're talking about what you're going to be delivering specifically to your participants. You're going to be talking about what strategies you've got to address barriers. You're going to be talking about what activities you're going to be delivering. You're going to say things like, we've partnered with an organisation in our local area who can provide interview outfits, or we've partnered with a business, an employment business who can help us do mock interviews to practice for employment interviews, or we're going to we've partnered with a cafe down the road who's actually going to provide a breakfast club for our participants, because we've realised when they turn up to training every day, many of them haven't had breakfast and they can't concentrate and they can't finish their work. So we're going to provide breakfast. Anything it is that you've decided you're going to do to try and address the barriers of your particular cohort that you know really, really well, this is where you're talking about that. This is about all the strategies you're going to use to assist participants. We've got a minibus and we're going to pick them up so they don't actually have to find their own way here. We're going to get them go-karts so they can get the bus here. Whatever it is that you've identified they need, this is where you talk about those things. Now, here's someone you might be familiar with, some of you, particularly if you are in the Logan area, someone who's delivered many Skilling Queenslanders for Work projects, who's going to talk about getting people into jobs. There we go. Paul does a great, he's been delivering Skilling Queenslanders for Work for many, many years now. So he's very well practiced in all the great strategies that work for the participants that they work with. So he's one that he's been really generous in sharing lots of tips with other organisations who might be looking to deliver a Skilling Queenslanders for Work. As you can see in those photos, they deliver a really wide range of qualifications. I think they do warehousing as well as hospitality and lots of different things there. And he showed some practical examples there of helping people get their driver's license, partnering with organisations who can provide an interview outfit. In some projects I've heard of, the partnership that the community organisation has with local employers, and this is detailed in their letter of support, includes those employers coming and doing like a talk during a morning tea once a week during the program to talk about what they're looking for from employees, like really getting those participants clued up as to what is going to help them get a job at the end of the program. So lots of different things to talk about there. Now we're nearing to the end here because we're up to criteria 4, which is where we talk about outcomes. So in this response, again, you've only got 2,800 characters, including spaces and punctuation. You need to describe how activities and qualifications will help participants gain employment. So this is where you're really using your expertise, going, we understand this cohort. We know when they're supported in this way, they will do these things. We're going to talk about how activities and qualifications relate to the community labour needs. You're going to talk about how your organisation has achieved similar outcomes previously. So you've already delivered SKU, that's a shoe-in because you can use your evaluation from your last one. But if you haven't, you do need to think about what you have delivered before and what you can talk about that will really help evidence, will help DESBIT or your funder feel confident about what you're saying you can do. They want to believe that you can say that you can do what you say you're going to do. Now for this one, there's no mandatory documentation. But if you have identified that a letter of support or previous projects or evaluation reports might be useful, you can add them here. For all the other criteria, you'll notice that there are mandatory attachments, that's what I'm looking for, like your audited financial statements and your letters of support, that kind of thing. For this criteria, there aren't any mandatory requirements, but if you recognise that there's something that would be useful for the funder to read, you can apply and you can attach it here. So this is from one of those SKU advisory, those regional committee members that do give advice to DESBIT about what projects they believe should be funded. And they've said that applicants need to show their connections to the community and to local employers and explain how they will move people into employment. And that's a really important thing to reiterate. Skilling Queenslanders work is not just about delivering a training program, and it's not just about getting people a job. It's about all of those things, both of those things together, plus wraparound support to make sure people have a meaningful longevity in the workforce. So they're not going to just last a few weeks, but 12 months down the track, they're still there, still having meaningful employment. How do I word my answer if my organisation is to start their first SKU program this month? Okay, so you have been successful in getting funding for a SKU program, but you haven't got the evaluation results for it yet. Is that right, Sia? What I would talk about then, if you're about to start, and when you say you're about to start, I'm not sure if you're about to start actually delivering or you're literally only just getting started now. But if you're about to start delivering, what you could talk about is, okay, so you're probably at that stage where you've got participants signed up, you've got your program design happen. And that's what I'd be talking about. I'd be talking about the success you've already had in, we're about to embark on the delivery of our first Skilling Queenslanders for Work project. We have met our projected participant numbers. We've used these channels to do that. We will be leveraging from the same channels to deliver another project. Anything that you see as being successful so far, I would be talking about those things. That should help evidence so far what you've been able to do to deliver a successful project. Talk about the relationships you've got and how you've been able to use those to get people into your program. And that's great. If you're already delivering a project, you're partway there. And, the more projects you deliver, the more opportunity you'll have to evidence that you have capacity to manage and deliver projects under this funding. And that will serve you well for other funding too. Okay, cost and value for money. Now, this is really important. What we should note about this is that funders are not always looking for, in fact, they're rarely looking for just the cheapest quote. So it's important to know that your budget needs to demonstrate cost effectiveness. It doesn't need to be the cheapest, because providing genuine wraparound support isn't cheap. So it doesn't need to be cheap, but you do need to justify your costs. And you do need to be really detailed in your budget. So one of the things that DESBIT often notes in applications is that budgets are too vague. Costs look like they're very much estimated, not really based on actual calculation. And often, particularly for staffing, organisations forget about things like superannuation, work cover, particularly if you've got traineeships, You need work cover costs in there. Think about if there's a scheduled pay increase. So if you're delivering a 6-month project and it's right when there's a pay increase scheduled, you're going to be cutting yourself short of funds if you haven't calculated what you need for that pay increase. Lots of different things to include. Also, when you're writing up your budget, it's very important to be detailed enough that if there's unexpected staffing changes during your project delivery, that the person taking on the project knows what the money is for. So I've definitely heard of circumstances where organizations had quite vague budgets and then someone leaves, as they do, and someone else comes into the organization to deliver the project, and they're looking at that budget going, it says $20,000 for staffing, but like, is this the SHADS award? What level? Is it a part-time role? Is it a full-time role? Does that include a manager plus a project officer, or is it just for the project? If you don't have those details in there, it's really hard to acquit the budget. And it's same as for things like materials and equipment. If you just put $5,000 for learning materials, what does that mean? It's really hard then to acquit the project at the end if the people working on the project don't really know the details of what the funding is for. But also when there's a vague budget, it makes the funder it really diminishes their confidence in the budget. They want to feel like they want to know that you have really thought through all the costs associated with your project. So you need to be really detailed. You need to be accurate. You're not just guessing numbers, but you've actually got quotes or their proper calculations that you've done, particularly when it comes to those staffing costs. Now, another thing to include that many organizations aren't great at doing is communicating your in-kind contribution. So someone mentioned earlier in the chat, a training room. So if you think about your local training room, I'm just making a guess here, maybe a local training room costs $500 a day to hire. If you've got a room in your organization, that's something you can put in your budget as your in-kind support. So you will say in your budget, your organization is actually contributing in kind $5,000 worth of training room costs. Same thing if you've got a minibus. Imagine how much it costs to hire a minibus every day. If that's an asset your organization has, you put it in the budget as in-kind support. So in your budget, you will say, we need funding for all of these things. We need funding for staff, and we need funding for materials. We need funding for this. Our go-cards that we're going to buy participants so they can get to and from the training example. And in-kind contribution, we're actually contributing $20,000 worth of all these other things that we're not going to charge you for. We're not going to ask for resourcing for, but our organisation is contributing to the project. That's the kind of thing that really helps funders see that your organisation is committed to delivering the work and that you've put a lot of thought into what you can contribute. The same goes for any partners who might be contributing in-kind costs. So there might be a cafe who has committed to providing breakfast, or there might be a caterer who said, oh, we'll provide a networking morning tea where you invite employers to come and you'll have your students there and they can all mingle and chat and make connections. So think about all the different things that will make up your program and who's funding all those bits and pieces and what might be in-kind contributions. Now, if an organisation or a business has committed to contributing something in kind, make sure it's in the letter of support, because you need to have some kind of evidence for that. You can't just put it in your budget and then try and get it later. You need to have some kind of commitment there from them that they will be delivering that. And here's another video to go over the budget. So there you go. There are lots of detail in the guide to applying for funding, which does outline what is eligible or ineligible for costs. And it's really, if they're reading through your budget, there's very clearly things in there that they've said in the eligibility, in the funding guidelines that are or aren't eligible, and you've got them in the budget. That will be very telling to them that maybe you haven't read the fine print. So office furniture and vehicles aren't eligible, so you can't go and buy a car for your organisation using the funding, but subsidised travel and meal programs, that is eligible. So have a look through those funding guidelines and make sure you're really clear on what is and isn't eligible. Another thing to note here for your budget is that there has been some confusion previously from SKU providers regarding the funding for post-participation support. Now, this is really important because if you put in your funding application and you're saying, well, our program is going to run from the 1st of January to the 30th of June, for example, but you've said that you're going to be supporting participants as they get into work, and that might be after the 30th of June. It's really important to note that that support that's provided to participants after your project end date must be in kind from your organisation. So you cannot then ask DESBIT to fund the cost of support that you gave participants after the project end date. So that's a really important thing just to keep in mind. Once your project end date happens, we're not saying cut off all support to participants, but if you are providing support to them, that's at a cost to your organisation. You can't then put that into recoup the cost for that. So do have a think about that when you're considering your budget and what post-participation support looks like. So this will be where your relationship with other organisations is really important, because if you know you can't provide particular support to a participant or an individual after a certain date, making sure that you have referred them to the right organisations so that they can receive other support that they need to ensure that they have success in the workplace. Okay, so hopefully by this stage, you've got a good idea for each criteria, what your key messages and what pieces of evidence you need for each criteria are. Now, these are just some handy tips. We're nearly at the end now. We've only got about 15 minutes left. This is just your editing bit. So this is where you're really refining those responses to make sure that you are using every word as well as you can, because remember, you've got a really short word count, so you need those responses to be really snappy. So there is software out there that can help you with this. One of them is Grammarly, and one of them is Hemingway. I will mention those ones to you in case you want to check them out. They are software programs that can provide writing feedback to you immediately. Now, they do use AI, some of them, to give you feedback. My point of advice would always be, whenever possible, and this isn't always possible, but whenever possible, get another person to read your application. And it's best to have someone proofread your work who has not been involved in the development of the idea. So when we are really familiar with a concept or a program or whatever it is that we're reading, it's much harder for us to pick up on where things aren't clear because we already know what the thing is about. So it is best, if at all possible, that you get someone to read it and proofread it who wasn't part of the project team at the beginning, because they will be able to give you really honest feedback about whether or not something makes sense. Because remember, your funder will have never probably heard of this before. This might be totally new information to them. So it's really important that there's clarity. And that it's really clear to the person reading it. Now, when we say, so we've got the 3 C's, the P and the O. So the 3 C's are clear, concise, and comprehensive. So for clear, use simple language. Don't use jargon, be specific. Be concise, so get straight to the point. Remember that those key messages. We're not wasting words talking about other things that aren't relevant to the thing that we're responding to. Remove words that don't add value. So for example, usually, actually, very, those kinds of words, they're not often actually needed, okay? Being concise and having clarity goes hand in hand. If you're waffling on, what you're trying to say is not going to be clear. Points must be obvious with explicit connections. Please don't waste word count talking about things that the funder hasn't actually asked you to talk about. Use your strongest examples and evidence to support each point. You might have lots of different things that you could talk about in your capacity to manage. Like you might be an organisation that's delivered 50 different programs. Obviously, you can't talk about all of them. So just pick your best examples to evidence your capacity. Limit acronyms. Remember, people or funders who are reading your application might not have ever worked in the sector before. So unless it's a really well-known acronym, don't use them. And obviously, you use the full word or term first, and then you can put it in brackets and use an acronym after that. Don't assume that the reader knows what those acronyms mean. Again, words like perhaps, maybe, try, attempt, possible are not really words that are needed. So make sure you go really carefully through all your wording and see if something could be made more concise. Now, again, your responses need to be comprehensive. So you need to respond to every element. You know, when we mapped out all the bits that would contribute to a criteria, don't think to yourself, well, I can talk about industry need and community need, but I can't really talk much about the needs, the wraparound support needs of our cohort. So I'm just going to skip that. I'm going to answer the rest of it really, really well, and they won't notice that I haven't really talked about that. They will notice because they have to give each of those things a score. So make sure you respond to every part of the selection criteria. Don't just respond to parts of it. Don't cherry pick. Be persuasive, so be specific, have evidence, use proper sources, like for example, your census data or your council data. Reflect the funder's language. So they're talking about particular things in the funding documents. Use those words in your funding application. Reflecting the language of the funder is a really good tip. It's an easy way to relate to the funder. And keep it on point. Keep things relevant. Link to the requirements and focus on benefits. Now, to talk about AI, because we can't talk about many things these days without touching on AI or artificial intelligence. Absolutely not telling people not to ever touch AI, because I think this is just the way of the world, and we need to figure out how we can use it safely and responsibly. So AI tool proponents, you can use AI to help with your idea generation or starting responses to application questions, or editing and polishing your questions. So for example, if you've got a really long response and you do want to edit it down, make it more concise, you could ask ChatGPT or another AI tool to help you do that. You just need to be mindful of a few things. So first, that we would caution you to consider confidentiality breaches. So putting in confidential information into AI is a breach of confidentiality. AI algorithms will sometimes produce what we call hallucinations, which they will talk about. An AI generated response might say, research shows, and we'll talk about something, but it doesn't actually quote the source. Like, it can't actually tell you what research it's talking about. And there has been instances where people have found that there is actually no research, it's just filled in the blanks. So it will talk about research shows something, or there has been reports that evidence but those reports don't actually exist. So if you're going to put something into your application, the onus is on you as the author to make sure that those sources do actually exist. So I would be mindful of using AI as a tool, maybe to help edit your writing or make something more succinct, but don't ask it to actually write your application for you, because there may be inconsistencies in there. And look, to be honest, at the end of the day, you know your organisation best, not AI. So you're going to be able to write about your organisation with a lot more accuracy than a tool like this can. Just be also mindful that sometimes AI is just a really sophisticated internet search, so there have been definitely copyright violations. I've heard funders say that they sometimes will get several applications for funding where all the applications have the same phrases in them, and it's become really clear that they've just kind of plugged it into AI. It spat out a really similar response for all of them, and then they have these several applications in front of them that all sound the same, and they've very clearly just been written by AI. So just being aware of things like that. It can be a useful tool, but there's some caution to use around that. To summarize, here are some of the pitfalls. Not addressing or evidencing all the criteria. So please, if you're responding to the criteria, make sure you respond to all of them, not just the ones that you feel confident to respond to. Another pitfall is unclear or insufficient information. So making sure you've got evidence for the things that you're saying. Lacking demonstration of or local cohort knowledge. So for organisations that maybe don't have great links to the local community, making sure you do that relationship establishment or partnering with people who do have those relationships before you put in your application. Another one is cutting and pasting from previous applications. So if you've been successful previously, that's brilliant. Just make sure that if you're reusing some wording, that you've got the right dates and updated data in your responses, because that's another one that funders have realised before. They've been reading an application and thinking, oh, these all say 2022, or something that's older, and it's very clear that they're just reusing an application that they've used previously. And another one is the inadequate or inaccurate budget, making sure someone adds it all up, make sure it has the right sum total at the end, making sure it's detailed enough so that if anyone else came into the project, they would be able to really clearly be able to see what is included in your budget and what's not. And after the funding decision is made, I hope you're all successful and you get that successful offer. Before you accept the funding, consider the costs involved in meeting the funding requirements. Give your budget another look over, making sure it's right. Just make sure you're clear about any legal or compliance requirements. So, for example, for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, you need to be able to, if the department requests it, you need to be able to pull out all the costs for your Skilling Queenslanders for Work project. So if you don't have a software system that can do that, that can pull out all the costs associated with one project, some organisations find it easier actually to establish a bank account just for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, so that it's easy for them to get all of those transactions out. So just having a think about all of those reporting, finance acquittal, things before you sign the dotted line. And that's for any funding that you're looking at that you've been offered. And get feedback on what went well and what you need to strengthen with your application. So many organisations miss this opportunity. If you are not successful, ask how you could make the application better next time and save that in your reference library so you can refer back to it later. I've gotten so many good pieces of advice because I've asked for feedback when I haven't been successful. And the same goes for when you are successful, because particularly for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, this is a funding opportunity that gets more and more competitive each time because more and more organisations find out about it. And if you, just because you were successful last time or this time, you might have only just scraped in and you might not realise that. So asking how you could improve your application next time could make the difference between missing out and getting it next time. So make sure you always ask for feedback, regardless as to whether you were successful or not. Okay, we've only got a few minutes left. I'm going to shift gears now. I'm going to really quickly talk about the Human Rights Act and Child Safe Organisations. So thanks for sticking with me. We're really near to the end. Hopefully you're all aware of the Human Rights Act. Now, this is important if you do gain funding. The Human Rights Act for Queensland came into act in, it was in January 2020 that it came into play. It involves 23 human rights, and it's really around modern human rights law, which has evolved since the late 1940s, initially in response to the atrocities of World War II. So after World War II, many countries across the world went, we don't want that to ever happen again. And so we need to develop some guidelines around what we call human rights. Now, Australia is signed up to most of the existing international human rights treaties, but treaties, it's only when those rights are incorporated into domestic legislation that they can be properly protected. So there is 3 jurisdictions in Australia. So Australia doesn't have a Human Rights Act, but there are 3 jurisdictions that do. That's the ACT, Victoria, and Queensland. And Queensland is the most recent one to come on board with that. Now, the reason this is relevant to you is the Human Rights Act applies to any government entities or public entities, including government agencies, departments, public service, Queensland Police, state hospitals, public schools. And it also applies to functional public entities, which are public entities that are considered public entities because they're performing an act on behalf of government. So if you receive government funding and you're delivering a service with that funding, you are considered to be kind of like an arm of the government. And so that's why the Human Rights Act applies to you. So if you're using government funding, you must abide by the Human Rights Act. There's 23 human rights. All individuals in Queensland have human rights. It doesn't matter if they're a resident or not. If they're in Queensland, they have human rights. Only individuals have human rights, not groups, not organisations, not businesses, just people, individual people. And there's heaps of information on the Queensland Human Rights Commission website if you need more information about this. There's also a lot of information on QCOS's website called Community Door. There's a human rights library that provides lots of information about the Human Rights Act and how it might apply to your organisation. I'll put some information in the chat if you would like to check that out. And another one to be aware of as an organisation delivering services is the National Principles for Child Safe Organisations. So these child safe principles were developed in response to the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, which uncovered some really shocking abuse of children across institutions and organisations in Australia. And I think we can all agree that it's everyone's responsibility to keep children in our community safe. Now, these national principles, all states and territories have agreed to them in principle. And different states and territories have made rules about how they actually embed these national principles in organisations. Now, Queensland has only just recently had a inquiry where organisations were asked to make submissions in response to the Child Safe Organisations reform. So in Queensland, we will see a rolling out of some guidance around how to do this in organisations. It's really important to note, though, that you might be in your Skilling Queenslanders for Work delivering services to technically children, young people who are considered minors. So it's very, very important that if you are working with young people or you're working with a cohort for whom you might be providing childcare facilities, like some organisations provide a creche for parents who are engaging in a training program. Really important that you're aware of your obligations as a child safe organisation so that you can abide by these principles to make sure we keep all children safe. There we go. Raced right to the end, got there. Just in the nick of time. I hope that's useful for you. Please be assured that we will be sending you an email with many of the resources that I talked about today. There are not only the slides, but also some of the grant on a page and other resources that I spoke about too, including all those little videos that you will be able to have a look at again. If you are applying for SKU, I wish you all the very best of luck. And if you would like to have a look at some more of the resources that we have available, we have a whole landing page on the QCOS website full of Skilling Queenslanders for Work information where you can find other recorded sessions. You can find, lots of different things to support your application writing. So thank you very much for your time. I do hope that that was useful for you. Let me know how you found the session in the chat, and I hope to see your organisations on the successful SKU funded projects list in the next 6 months or so. Thanks, Alana. Thank you, Deb. Thanks for your comments too. Great discussion. Thank you very much. Great, Raymond. Thank you. Really glad to hear it. Have a great afternoon, everyone.